Riot Games and its CEO are being sued for workplace harassment and gender discrimination. The recently filed complaint caps off a years-long investigation into an allegedly toxic workplace. The gaming giant has been sued for both of these things before, as well as allegedly firing women who've decided to speak out. Riot says they made a lot of changes since the allegations were made, but this complaint begs to differ. On February 9th, a legal complaint was filed by former Riot employee Sharon O'Donnell against the company and her former boss, CEO Niccolo Laurent. I say complaint because there is a difference between a legal complaint and a lawsuit. A complaint refers to all of the documents filed explaining the allegations, while a lawsuit refers to the actual legal proceedings that take place in court. O'Donnell was hired as Laurent's assistant in October of 2017 and was eventually fired in July of 2020. The complaint alleges that, throughout her time working for Riot, O'Donnell experienced multiple instances of harassment and gender discrimination. Quote, shortly after the plaintiff was hired, the defendant Laurent began a pattern of harassing the plaintiff based on her sex or gender. This continued until the end of her employment, end quote. The complaint includes a laundry list of specific allegations, one of which is an instance where Laurent allegedly asked O'Donnell to come over to his house while his wife and kids were away. Note the spelling. The complaint alleges that Laurent constantly demeaned O'Donnell and references a time where Laurent was allegedly, quote, staring at her in a sexual fashion when discussing his underwear, while telling the plaintiff that he really was a size extra large, but that he just liked a tight fit, end quote. On top of that, the complaint alleges that O'Donnell was forced to work overtime she was never paid for and rarely was given her legally mandated work breaks. The complaint also states that once she refused Laurent's advances and went to HR to complain about his behavior, her work duties were stripped away and she was eventually fired. The complaint says that by not paying her for her overtime work and not giving her her legally mandated work breaks, Riot violated the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA, in the United States. And if you didn't know, FEHA was passed in 1959 to help fight against sexual harassment and other forms of unlawful discrimination in employment and housing. The complaint also alleges that Riot Games as a company failed to take all of the necessary steps to stop this alleged behavior and essentially just ignored everyone who came forward to talk about it. According to the complaint, things got so bad for O'Donnell that she had to seek out medical attention. Quote, as a further and proximate result of the discrimination as aforepled, the plaintiff was required to and did seek medical attention and will need medical attention in the future, end quote. Now, O'Donnell's experience that we've been talking about so far is not an isolated incident. In fact, this story goes all the way back to 2018. In August of 2018, Kotaku published an in-depth investigation into the workplace culture of Riot. By speaking to 28 current and former employees, the investigation was able to highlight a series of systemic issues relating to alleged sexism, harassment, and abuse of power by management. In particular, the piece describes a workplace where women were consistently turned down for leadership positions, as well as a list that was allegedly passed around by senior management describing women at the company they'd like to sleep with. By November of 2018, a few months after the original story broke, one current, at the time, and one former Riot employee filed a class action lawsuit against the company alleging systemic gender discrimination.
Developer surveys consistently find that discrimination and sexism are endemic to the gaming industry, but to understand how bad it's gotten, we have to look at one company in particular that is crushing it on the sexism leaderboard.
Riot Games just can't escape controversy. This week, the League of Legends developer was slammed with a class action lawsuit claiming that the company fosters a sexist work environment.
In the ensuing aftermath of the reporting and the class action lawsuit, Riot went into full-on crisis mode. They rolled out a bunch of diversity initiatives on their website and basically said, hey, we're not actually women-hating douchebags. This continued into 2019 as Riot doubled down on the whole "we're changing" promise. But the thing that made this go international and caused one of the biggest walkouts that the games industry has ever seen was something called forced arbitration, which is a tactic designed to stop employees suing for all sorts of workplace violations, including gender discrimination and harassment. It works like this. If an employee files a workplace lawsuit against their employer, forced arbitration makes it so that there's no public trial. Instead, a company hires a private litigator to reach a settlement behind closed doors, away from any public spotlight. It's a pretty nefarious tactic that companies like Google have stated that they've stopped using. Not Riot Games, though. Because in April of 2019, almost 8 months after that original Kotaku investigation, Riot filed a motion blocking employees from suing them for harassment. In other words, forced arbitration. According to Riot at the time, the argument was simple. As soon as these women were hired, they waived any right to sue. On May 6th, 2019, Riot Games employees and other games industry employees from around the world staged a gigantic walkout in protest of Riot's forced arbitration policies and the entire situation as a whole. We reported on this at the time in one of the very early episodes of this show.
Over the past few months, Riot Games has been under a ton of criticism. Current and former employees have accused the company of fostering a toxic, sexist workplace culture and breaking California labor laws, which all led to a walkout last month, and based on how it went, we're in for a lot more action.
In response to the walkouts, Riot announced they'd be changing their policy on forced arbitration. Sort of. Quote, ultimately, given the complexities of ongoing litigation, we will not change our employee agreements while in active litigation. Everything we've heard will impact our discussions when we revisit arbitration, and we hope to have an answer that will be satisfying to everyone. At a minimum, we will give new rioters the option to opt out of arbitration on individual sexual harassment claims. End quote. So what Riot essentially said here was, hey, if you're currently suing us because we're shitty, well, tough luck. But in the future, if you sue us for being shitty, well then we won't force you into closed-door arbitration. On top of that wishy-washy statement, Riot announced a new diversity and inclusion department with the goal to, quote, leverage a group of engaged and thoughtful rioters from teams across the company to participate in formal discussions on D&I. End quote. All of this was happening throughout the summer of 2019, and by December of that same year, the class action lawsuit that was filed in 2018 finally came to an end. A court ordered Riot to pay out $10 million, spread out amongst every woman who had worked for Riot in the past 5 years. And according to one of the plaintiff's lawyers at the time, this settlement was one of the largest in California history for gender discrimination lawsuits. From there, things died down for a while, and everyone hoped that Riot was taking their diversity initiative seriously. Which brings us back to now, almost 2 years later, on the cusp of another lawsuit alleging the same sexist behavior, this time leveled at the CEO of the company. And in terms of a resolution, O'Donnell is looking for compensation over the lost wages from the overtime she worked, as well as damages stemming from the emotional and mental health turmoil she experienced while working for Riot and Laurent. Now, I reached out to Riot for a statement about this whole situation, and here's what they had to say. Quote, in this case, because some of the claims relate to an executive leader, a special committee of our board of directors is overseeing the investigation, which is being conducted by an outside law firm. Our CEO has pledged his full cooperation and support during this process, and we're committed to ensuring that all claims are thoroughly explored and appropriately resolved. One subject we can address immediately is the plaintiff's claim about their separation from Riot. The plaintiff was dismissed from the company over 7 months ago, following more than a dozen complaints from both employees and external partners, and after offering multiple coaching discussions to try and address these concerns. Any suggestion otherwise is simply false. End quote. So almost 2 years later, have things actually changed at Riot? They would argue yes, pointing to multiple diversity initiatives that they've started. But it's a pretty rough look when the CEO of the very company that says it's changing for the better is being accused of the exact same things that caused one of the biggest walkouts in the history of the games industry.
Thanks for watching. If you want more content like this, hit the sub button and ring that notification bell. For unique bite-sized videos you won't find anywhere else, hit up our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook pages.